Now, what's happened, unfortunately, in most of the current discourse is that a lot of Muslim economists have been trained in modern economic theory, but they have not been trained in terms of the wisdom tradition of Islam. And so for them, they often think of Islamic economics as a modern economy with Islamic economic law. And that simply is not going to work. That's going to be kind of like a Frankenstein, so to speak. In other words, it's taking something from one worldview and trying, in which work does not have spiritual meaning, it does not have a spiritual significance. The work and the science behind the work is not integrated into higher orders of knowledge, so the work does not have symbolic meaning to it to satisfy the spiritual need of the worker or the patron, of the craftsman or craftswoman, or the patron of the art. And on the other hand, trying to kind of put Sharia on the back end and Islamic law on the back end. And so all of these approaches, most of the approaches of the Muslim economists that you'll see today are generally very inadequate because they don't bring the full Islamic tradition to bear on an Islamic economy. And so if we do not have a clear vision of the Islamic economy, then when it comes to Islamic economic theory that is supposed to be able to examine the consequences of socioeconomic consequences for equilibrium between an Islamic and other types of economies, it's going to be in a very compromised position. Why is that? Because it doesn't have the starting point of analysis of the Islamic economy to begin with. In other words, all Muslim economists are going to agree that an Islamic economy, or it's an economy informed by spiritual principles, is going to lead to socioeconomic equilibrium. And you all mentioned here that you have a socially responsible society and so forth, and that's searching for the common good and things like that. But what is necessary for that socially responsible economy and the common good are precisely those inner dimensions combined with the Sharia. And so if those are missing, how is it that Muslim economists are going to argue that an Islamic economy is going to lead to socioeconomic equilibrium, whereas industrial capitalism or socialism or communism are not? Do you all see the problem there? Does that make sense?
And shouldn't one add sort of philosophizing about, the intellectual aspect of things? The spiritual, the practical, and the philosophical, would you add? You're assuming that's part of the spiritual wisdom tradition.
Oh yes, absolutely. Now, I'm kind of, in a sense, instead of talking about it in terms of the dimensions of Islam, Iman, and Ihsan, I'm just kind of putting Iman and Ihsan as, I'm calling that the wisdom tradition.
Yes, correct.
And then I'm saying Islam related to Sharia, to fiqh, and so forth, is the legal tradition. And so we have the wisdom tradition that includes Islamic philosophy, the integration of science into higher orders of knowledge, how that informs production processes to make them spiritually meaningful and significant, and so forth and so on. That's on one hand, and then the Sharia is on the other. So we have the wisdom tradition and the legal tradition, and they work hand in hand. And Islamic economic theory is going to be compromised at the very beginning if we are unable to articulate how it is that an Islamic economy is going to lead to socioeconomic equilibrium, whereas other economies are not, or at least an economy informed by spiritual principles will lead to socioeconomic equilibrium, whereas other economies would not, if we don't even have the proper understanding of that economy that's informed by the spiritual principles. So Islamic economic theory, unfortunately, is in a state of, I don't know, you might say it's just floundering, because they have not defined what it is, what an Islamic economy really is. And the reason they have not defined what an Islamic economy really is because they're not aware of that wisdom tradition, and they're approaching things as if production processes are spiritually neutral, and which of course they're not. But they're basically adopting many of the philosophical presuppositions of basically secular sciences of man and nature. And as a result of that, their analysis is compromised at the very beginning. So in a sense, you can say that there is no such thing as Islamic economic theory in the modern sense of the term. Although there certainly is such a thing as an Islamic economy. All right, so let's compare then, let's go into this a little bit more by discussing these things in terms of two aspects. We want to take a look at short-term equilibrium or disequilibrium, short-term, look at things from a short-term point of view, and then consider things from a long-term point of view. Well, actually, let's discuss the long-term issues first. Let's think about the environmental crisis, because this is the biggest thing facing the entire, the entire globe now. This is the biggest challenge. All of the short-term issues don't matter if we don't address the environmental crisis properly. Now, if production processes are not spiritually meaningful, then what does that imply for our treatment of the environment? What's going to happen if we find spiritual satisfaction in the work that we're doing? What is that going to lead to in terms of our treatment of the environment?
Catastrophe.
Yeah, catastrophe. Elaborate on that. Why?
It's just soulless, and it's just like a jungle of benefits and yeah, something like that. You know what I mean? Guys, speak up. Yeah, it's like
It would be just production, right?
production.
It would be just production.
Overuse of massive,
As well, yeah.
deplete all our
Resources,
resources.
right.
Like Pakistan has lost all its forest
Right.
due to greed, nothing else.
Exactly. Exactly. If we're not finding spiritual meaning in the work, it's going to lead to consumerism. People are going to try to fulfill that hole that is there as a result of the loss of spiritual meaning of work through consumption. So we will look for the infinite in the finite. And therefore, it's going to lead to abuse of nature, and lack of gratitude. Will never feel content. And then it almost becomes, that consumerism almost becomes like salt water. You know, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which he mentioned that, you know, if the person who's dominated by the nafs al-ammara is given a valley of gold, what else are they going to want next? Another valley of gold. You know, the first $1 billion, as soon as they make that, or the first million, then they want to make another million. And then the first billion, that's not enough. They want to make another billion. And you see people like that. And that's because the spiritual needs are not being met. And so they're looking for it in other terms. And then that leads to this type of, the more you get, the more you want, and people are just forever dissatisfied. I'm sorry, did somebody...
No, our sort of screen is malfunctioning a little bit. I'm just trying to correct that.
Oh, I see.
Because your image has become very small and our image has become large.
Oh, I see. All right.
It's never happened before.
Well, no, that's probably as it should be. Anyway, so
I think we'll bear with this. Bismillah. Sorry.
All right, sure. Inshallah. So the environmental crisis is basically a result of loss of spiritual meaning of work. It's the loss of those dimensions of Iman and Ihsan. And because there's a lag time between when people abuse the environment and the full effects of the damage, the environmental crisis in a meaningful way. Anything less than that is really dealing with the symptoms rather than the root cause. And a beautiful analogy that Dr. Nasr has used in this regard is that he said that many attempts at dealing with the environmental crisis are really cosmetic. It's almost like you're having a patient who's dying of cancer and in stage 4 cancer, and the face is turning yellow and skin is turning yellow and all of that, and you put makeup. That's not going to save the patient from dying. But this is pretty much what we're doing. Because what's driving the environmental crisis ultimately is this worldview, a secular worldview, a mechanistic worldview that reduces quality to quantity. And I assume, I'm not sure, have you discussed the Islamic sciences of nature yet?
That'll be later in another term, when we come to the Islamic sort of tradition.
I see. So what's really, behind all of this is basically a holistic approach to the sciences versus a mechanistic reductionist approach to the sciences. That's really what's at stake here. So you have two different worldviews. One is a holistic worldview, the other is a mechanistic worldview. Those are in turn those worldviews are generating different scientific, technological, economic, political, social, and other structures that are in turn generating patterns of events of which specific events are the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. This is called systems theory, in which it looks at any particular crisis event or even a positive event in terms of not in terms of an isolated event, but as part of a pattern that's being generated by structures that are being generated by an underlying worldview. So what we see outwardly is literally the tip of the iceberg. We see the particular event, but we don't often recognize what's going on below that event, just in the same way that an iceberg will see that tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot more to it that's going on underneath. And so until we address this worldview, we're really just dealing with symptoms rather than root cause of the problem. And so Islamic economics and Islamic economic theory is going to be addressing the root cause of the crisis, whereas secular economic theory is dealing only with symptoms, because it's failing to address the worldview that is generating all of these problems to begin with. In other words, it's looking for solutions within the worldview that is generating the crises. And so that's simply not going to work. Oh, by the way, I've shared my screen by mistake. How do I undo that?
There should be either in the plus sign, if you go to below the image, or to the right.
Oh, I'll see. Stop. That was my fault then.
Not a problem.
I was trying to be sharing. So
those are very, very important points that you were focusing on. I mean, that's the crux of the matter.
yes, yes. And so that's really the difference between Islamic economic theory and secular economic theory, that Islamic economic theory is going to go to the root causes of the problems rather than trying to deal with the symptoms, because it's addressing the paradigm and worldview within which all of these other structures and so-called solutions that they're proposing are based. And really, in a sense, you might say the metaphysical error of modern economic thought is that it tries to say that being selfish is going to lead to socioeconomic equilibrium. That in a sense, economics is a separate domain. You know, in politics, if you said to somebody in politics that, oh, intentions are irrelevant and you can have good intentions or bad intentions in politics and still get good results, somebody would say, of course, that can't be right. You know, politics requires good intentions and therefore to get good results. And if a ruler is full of vice or the ruling elite is full of vice, then we're going to get negative results. We're not going to get the common good. Now, economists are trying to make the argument that one can be selfish or indifferent to the common good and still get good results. And this is called the separate domain argument. Economics is a separate domain from other social activities, such as politics or social structures and so forth. And the way that economists argue this is that if there is a problem in which the separate domain argument fails, then the real problem is that we don't have enough markets to address, to make the separate domain argument valid. Let me give you an example. Returning to the environmental crisis and pollution. Economists recognize that there is such a thing as negative externalities. So, for example, if there's a manufacturer who's polluting, and that manufacturer is next to a laundry mat, a launderer, then the launderer is going to be suffering the consequences of that pollution because there's no market for the pollution. But if there was a market in which the clean air had a price to it, then there would be a way to eliminate those negative externalities. And I can see by the shaking of your heads that many of you are kind of familiar with that. Is everybody familiar with the economist arguments related to negative externalities, positive externalities, and so forth?
No, I don't think so. But I think the logic, they're appreciating the logic, they're understanding the concept.
All right, very good, because it's exactly that. Basically, a negative externality is a situation in which somebody is doing something that has a negative impact on other parties that they're not being compensated for, or is not being corrected. And that's because either a lack of regulation or a lack of pricing. So, for example, the manufacturer who's polluting is not taking into account the damage that they're causing to the laundromat. Now, if they were taking, and so therefore it's a negative externality, it's external to what the manufacturer is seeking to do, to kind of maximizing the profits. And the argument of economists is that they can try to include the price of that negative externality and charge that to the manufacturer, so to speak, or compensate the laundry owner through a market mechanism so that the market is going to work and eliminate any of those negative externalities. And so we're going to get efficient outcomes, and everybody can just be selfish and not worry about those negative externalities. Now, what is wrong with that argument? Because that's the argument that economists are going to make. That's an example of economists claiming that the solution to the problem is within that secular paradigm. Do you all see the logic behind that? They're saying self-interest leads to good results, that you don't have to be concerned about the welfare of others. That's their claim. And if there is a failure from that, or if there's a deviation from that, if there's any negative outcomes, then the solution is more markets. Does everybody see the logic of that? Yeah. So they're looking for a solution within that secular paradigm. Now, Islamic economics is going to claim that, no, that's not going to work. Because true equilibrium, in a sense, is the intersection of vertical equilibrium in our relationship with Allah, and therefore this kind of holistic approach to things, and horizontal equilibrium. Whereas the economists are only going to be looking for that equilibrium on that single plane. So can anybody think of what's wrong with the economist argument from an Islamic point of view?
The spiritual aspect is missing for sure.
Absolutely, the spiritual aspect is totally missing.
They're putting a price to everything. They're putting a price. Everything becomes an economic resource. Even
That's
things
right.
which are supposed to be like water and air, which are supposed to be abundant and free, become scarce as well. Instead of scarcity becomes the common the main, and therefore everything becomes part of an economic system and resource.
That's right. That's right. And so you're putting your finger on something that is in principle wrong with the economic approach. And I want to return to that, but I want to look for something that's very practical, a very practical reason why the economist's argument is going to fail first before we turn to your argument that's in principle. So what's a very practical reason that the economist's argument is not going to work?
Because I think the resources are limited. That I think the greatest flaw.
Right? Absolutely.
Resources are limited.
The resources are limited. But which agency is supposed to be creating these markets or to be enforcing all of these things to prevent the manufacturer from polluting the laundry? Who's supposed to do that?
A sense of responsibility, that everything is not, since everything belongs to God, so we are responsible as consumers and as
right.
Now
that's certainly the case from the Islamic perspective, absolutely.
Yeah.
But to do that, we need the spiritually significant production processes to begin with. So let's look at it from their point of view, from the economist's point of view. production processes at the manufacturer have no spiritual. They're in it for the profits. So who is it that's which agency is going to be there to prevent the manufacturer from polluting or at least compensating the laundry owner?
The
Who's going to do that?
authority.
Role of the state. Role of the state.
Yes, the state, the government. The government is supposed to be taking care of these things to assure fairness. Now, if the manufacturer is making a lot of money from all of this pollution, what is the manufacturer going to do with that money if legislation is introduced to compensate the laundry owner?
He's going to use it to lobby.
Oh, yes, exactly. That's right.
Also, if it only happens, then we can have this question.
Sorry?
If only it happens, if only when it happens, then the question arises. What happened? Oh, it just happens really. It's sort of delayed, or doesn't happen at all. This kind of.
No, there is no such legislation. The state doesn't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, there's going to be gutting of the things. There's a whole beautiful studies done on this by Robert Reich, in which he has a book called Saving Capitalism for the Many, Not the Few, in which he discusses how it is that these organizations, these large corporations, are simply going to lobby the government, and the government then becomes, the politicians are in the pockets of the corporations. And essentially what we have is a corporatocracy right now in the United States. This is not democracy. It's a corporatocracy. And there was, Robert Reich quotes a study from political science professors at Stanford and I think it was Princeton, where they examined legislation, bills that were introduced in the US Congress between 2000 and, I don't know, 2009 or something like that. And they examined what percentage of those bills passed that corporations did not like. Would anybody care to guess, even if the American people wanted that legislation very much, would anybody care to guess what percentage of those bills passed?
0%.
That is correct. 0%. So you can have the majority of the American people, 80% of the American people, behind a particular piece of legislation. If the corporate interests are opposed to it, it is not going anywhere. Then, even assuming by some miracle, yani an act of Allah, that the bill passes, what is the corporation's next step going to be? Once you have the laws on the books, what do you need to have in addition to laws on the books?
Ethics.
Interest of that.
Well, you have to have enforcement, right? You have to have federal agencies enforcing the rules.
No.
Government agencies enforcing the law.
Exactly.
There's plenty of great laws on the books in many countries. But are the laws enforced? Not necessarily. And so the second strategy of the interest groups is to gut the funding of the agencies that are going to enforce those laws. They'll cut the funding so they can't do their job. You know, it's amazing. Citibank had a package. There's this very cozy relationship between the government and the corporations. They call it the revolving door policy. I'm sure you all have heard of it. where there's this kind of rotation between, in one administration, you'll get some executives from the corporation coming in for years. They establish their network of relationships, and then they leave the government so that then they can come in and lobby more effectively and so forth. Citibank had an incentive program for their employees, for their high executives, that they would give them multi-million-dollar bonuses for them to go into the government.
Amazing.
It's absolutely amazing. It's incredible. And Robert Reich discusses all of this in his book, Saving Capitalism. Now, was the United States always like this? No way.
No.
Back in the 19th century, and it's such a wonderful quote, I really should have pulled it up ahead of time, because the way the Supreme Court ruled on this particular issue is just, stunning. The Supreme Court had a case in 1870 something, I think, in which there was a man who was owed money by the government, and the government was slow to pay. I guess it was because of, the Civil War and so forth. It had, a big impact, and the government was slow to pay. So this man hired another person to lobby the government to get his money. And then this went to the Supreme Court because when basically he didn't pay the guy to do it, ultimately. And so the lobbyist took the case to the Supreme Court saying, I didn't get paid, I should have gotten paid, this was the contract. What do you think the Supreme Court did in the 1870s to that case? Now, in the 1870s, they were more ethical. So what the Supreme Court ruled is no way. That contract is not a binding contract. It's illegal. If we allow this kind of lobbying, they put it so eloquently. They said this would be a kind of the basis for the corruption of government if we allow this type of thing. And then, unfortunately, what happened later on is that the Supreme Court reversed itself about 100 years later, saying that, no, it's all right, corporations can go ahead and lobby. And that opened the floodgates for all of this that we see now. And so as a result, since the 1970s, productivity in the United States has essentially doubled. Would anybody care to guess what average wages adjusted for inflation have done over those since the 1970s?
Probably halved.
Probably remain stagnant.
It's remained completely stagnant. And the percentage of GDP of U.S. corporate profits is at record high levels. In other words, it represents a total transfer of wealth. And Robert Reich calls it the pre-distribution of income, which I think is a wonderful name for it. They've adjusted the rules of the game by lobbying the government, so there's a pre-distribution of income in their favor. They don't even have to wait till the income gets distributed and then get it back to themselves. They rig the game at the very beginning to make sure there's a pre-distribution of income. And he goes through the various laws and how this whole thing happened. And there's another book that goes into even more detail on this called Tailspin by Stephen Brill. That's a brilliant work. I think that's the best work on it. But Robert Reich's book gives a great overview first, and then we'll get into the details regarding Stephen Brill goes down to a lower level of resolution, so to speak. But Robert Reich's book gives a good, a higher level overview of the map. But what neither of those books do is identify the root source of the problem. What is the root source of the problem? work does not have spiritual meaning. That is the root source of the problem. And why does work not have spiritual meaning? Because the sciences of nature, the secular of scientism, which is defined as empirical means of knowing the material world, claiming that that has a monopoly on knowledge, is the bedrock of the modern worldview, of the mechanistic worldview. And so if that's the case, work is not going to have spiritual meaning. There's going to be lobbying. Everything is just about the paycheck. There's going to be lobbying of the government for the short-term self-interest of these corporations. There's not going to be long-term thought because the delay between cause and effect on these environmental issues. And so we have the conditions for a total disaster. I mean, we're going to commit collective suicide. So the economist's argument that we can use secular solutions to solve these problems and maintain economics as a separate domain divorced from ethical considerations completely fails. Because market failure is going to be complemented by government failure as a result of special interest groups. And so we're going to have the environmental crisis on the one hand, and a completely skewed distribution of income on the other, which is based, and that skewed distribution of income is the result of injustice because of the special interest groups that are pre-distributing the income, so to speak. And injustice leads not only to that long-term environmental economic crisis that threatens all of us, but it also leads to short-term instability. That's why there's so much economic instability. That's why every, decade there's some kind of financial banking crisis, whatever it is. So injustice leads to short-term instability and long-term unsustainability. And all of this is being driven by that secular mechanistic worldview. And so what we need to recover for an authentic Islamic economy to exist ultimately is the recovery of the Islamic sciences of nature and the spiritual meaning of nature, a holistic approach to philosophy and science. And for that, we need to recognize the role of vertical causality, not only horizontal causality. Horizontal causality is a situation in which the cause is on the same ontological level as the effect. And horizontal causality acts in time. Vertical causality, on the other hand, is a situation in which the cause is on a higher ontological level than the effect. And that does not act in time, it acts instantaneously. And in quantum mechanics, I know this is going to take us a little bit further into a deeper level, but basically what we've been taught in high school and college chemistry classes, that you have a little proton, electron, neutron, and they're little billiard ball particles that are bouncing around out there, and they're just purely quantitative. There's no qualitative aspect to that. Is that the way you all have normally been taught chemistry?
Yes.
Yeah, me too. I mean, the same thing. And it's really not till college that one gets into, quantum chemistry and so forth. But anyway, to make a long story short, quantum mechanics has eliminated the idea that there are billiard ball particles out there. There are no billiard ball particles out there that are purely quantitative. It's a state vector of possibilities. It's a potentiality that needs to be actualized into an actual corporeal body of quality and quantity, that in a world that we experience, in the same way that you have water that is cold that could be potentially hot, you have to have something that's actually hot to make that potentially hot water hot, right? So in the same way, in quantum mechanics, there has to be an act of consciousness that causes the state vector to collapse. And I'd like to, really, quite frankly, I'll send you a little, just 4 pages that summarizes this in a book called The Quantum Enigma, in which it shows how, that's written by 2 physicists, and it's uncontroversial what they're saying from a quantum mechanics point of view, that basically physics has met consciousness in quantum mechanics. Now, what's the importance of that? The importance of that is that instead of having lifeless matter out first and then life as an accident of that lifeless matter, and consciousness as an accident of life, we have consciousness at the very beginning. That consciousness causes the state vector to collapse. And that consciousness has a qualitative dimension. It's not reducible to quantity. And so the corporeal world that we perceive is both qualitative and quantitative, and that's how we can understand everything as ayatullah, as a finite reflection of the infinite qualities of Allah. And that returns us to the early surah, in Surah Al-Nahl, where Allah is telling us that He's created all of these things of beauty. That is a quality. Those things of beauty are finite reflections of His infinite beauty. And it is objective. And so it can be ayatullah. And therefore, it can fulfill our spiritual needs. And so the spiritual meaning of work and production processes depends on vertical causality. Do you see that, how that is related? So the Islamic sciences of nature that are based on both vertical and horizontal causality are the ones that are necessary for work to be spiritually meaningful for us. If we do not have Islamic sciences of nature, there is no such thing as an Islamic approach to the making of things. If there's no such thing as the Islamic approach to making of things, then work does not satisfy our spiritual needs. If work does not satisfy our spiritual needs, then we are into this disaster that we currently are facing, both in terms of the environmental crisis and in terms of instability and in terms of all the drug abuse and social escapism that people, that are engaging in here in the United States, precisely because work does not have spiritual meaning for them.
Yeah.
And so all of these things can be related to the root cause, and the necessary condition for all of this is to recover that intellectual heritage. And I'll close just by saying that there's this beautiful new book that was just came out 2 weeks ago, or 2.5 weeks ago, by Wolfgang Smith and Jean Barella. It says, the title of it is Rediscovering the Integral Cosmos, Physics, Metaphysics, and Vertical Causality.
Wonderful.
It's an incredible book. This is the most important book. I think this book is a game changer. If people took this book seriously, this has massive implications for all other fields. It helps us to once again find God in all things, and has massive implications for economics, and it also relates to our Islamic intellectual heritage in the sense that Omar Khayyam, Nasiruddin Tusi, and Ibn Sina made the distinctions that Wolfgang Smith is making in this. So we have this in our Torah, but we need a book like this to help us, in a sense, recover that. And Dr. Nasr, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, has written a something about this in his book on Islamic philosophy from its origin to its present, in which he discusses Omar Khayyam's work in relation to this book on. And so, anyway, I guess I'll just close with that, with the main principle being that vertical causality is necessary in our sciences of nature, in our sciences of man, and in economics, whereas the secular paradigm is based on only horizontal causality. And that's why it's not going to work. That's why conventional economic theory is going to fail, and the conventional secular economic system is also going to fail. And it's really our responsibility as Muslims, because quite frankly, the Muslim community is more intellectually rigorous, you might say, and vigorous, because we're a younger religion than the Christianity in the West. It's tragic what's happened in the Christian West. I mean, it's unbelievable. Yani, I don't even have time. We should have a whole, if we wanted to discuss that, we need a whole other lecture to talk about all the kind of craziness that's going on here intellectually. But really, it's been lost. But the West right now is in a state of intellectual and spiritual chaos. And the Muslim community can really provide a perspective that is a source of meditation for the Christian West to recover its own intellectual and spiritual heritage. And that's going to be necessary if we have a future going forward. So that's my sermon for this morning, or tonight.
MashaAllah, that was brilliant, eloquent, and really came across very clearly. I think that was a very precious discourse, and I think it brought together a lot of things which they have looked at separately, right, and which they are going to now go into more and more. This sort of, because now they're going to look at other manifestations of exactly the mechanistic, scientific worldview in culture, in art, and I think that this is a brilliant start, and I can't thank you enough.
Thank you very much. Barakallah feek. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's always fun to do this. Alhamdulillah.